Hi everyone. This video lesson is going to focus in on the work of Susan Glaspell, an American author and playwright, and we're specifically going to be talking about her one-act play Trifles. There are going to be two parts to this lesson. The first part is going to discuss Glaspell's life and give you an overview of the play, the setting, the characters, and the plot. And then the second part is going to reel the camera in to focus on Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, some of the symbols in the play, the modern elements, the unresolved questions that remain even when the play ends, and then one kind of underlying message that can be connected with this play. Susan Glaspell was born in 1876, died in 1948. She was born in the Midwest in Iowa. Eventually, she became a journalist, a fiction writer, a novelist, and a playwright. My understanding is that she also earned a PhD in philosophy, which would have been just a really remarkable achievement at this time historically. Not just getting a PhD, but getting a PhD in philosophy just would have been really noteworthy. She did win a Pulitzer Prize in 1930 for a piece that she wrote that's based loosely on Emily Dickinson's life. And she also helped found a little theater group, the Provincetown Players. And there's an actual movement called the Little Theater Movement that was kind of different artists and writers and playwrights who wanted to create drama that was less about making money and being commercial successes and more about kind of conveying more substantive ideas. So Susan Glaspell helped found one of these little theater groups. They were dedicated to more experimental tactics in the performing and the writing of these plays. And interestingly enough, Eugene O'Neill was part of this group. So Susan Glaspell and Eugene O'Neill did work together as part of the Provincetown Players. She was influenced in part by Henrik Ibsen. If you read A Dollhouse, or sometimes it's translated A Doll's House, in perhaps one of your previous English classes, you might find some similarities between Nora Helmer and Minnie Wright. And in fact, if you were to look at the covers of, like the book covers of a publication of A Doll's House and a publication of Trifles, what you might see is that the cover illustration is a bird cage, and that's because the idea of a bird and a cage, those ideas, are significant symbols in both of these texts. But she was also influenced by Ibsen in terms of her content, and especially in her dedication to realism in her writing. She is an early feminist writer. Not everything that she wrote was serious or heavy. A lot of what she wrote for some of the women's magazines where she was published was much lighter and more frothy. And she wrote Trifles in 1916, that's when it was published, based on a case that she had covered as a journalist. And so she just decided after covering it, she wrote countless articles, maybe in the 20 plus articles, something like that, about this actual murder case, and eventually decided to write a play about it, and then later converted it into, or rewrote it as a short story titled A Jury of Her Peers. And to me, this Trifles play, it's a fascinating play. It's short, it's a quick read, and it kind of might be like the podcast Serial in that, or maybe the process by which Glaspell eventually creates the play, and it'd be very interesting to go back and read all of the articles that she wrote. She's kind of tracing this case as it unfolds in the courts, and then eventually lands at what she writes into this play. So in that way, it's kind of like a serial podcast or a whodunit kind of show. The setting of this play, the temporal setting, is in the early 1900s. And you want to keep in mind women's political status at this time. They did not have voting rights and therefore couldn't serve on juries, which is, I think, one of the reasons why Glaspell titled the short fiction version of this play A Jury of Her Peers, because that is what happens to Minnie Wright. She's tried by a jury of her peers in the plot of both of these texts. Also, what's important about women's status at this time is that they were still part of this society where there were the separate spheres, where men were supposed to be out in the marketplace or working outside the home, and women were expected to be in the home and take care of all the domestic duties. So this is still the era of when the cult of domesticity was definitely influencing gender norms during this time. The time of day is morning. Um, for what that's worth. And also, it's winter time. And that kind of parallels the cold season and the cold atmosphere of this house. As far as the spatial setting, the play is set on a farm in the Midwest, and the farmhouse has been recently abandoned because of the death of John Wright and because Minnie Wright is now in jail. And you also might take a look at the physical location of the men and women, not just at the beginning of the play, but also as the play continues, because they're very rarely in the same space. And that can function kind of as a picture of where they are in terms of their view of the situation and also how they go about determining what happened. So that's some information about the setting of this play. The characters of the play are the county attorney, George Henderson. Henry Peters is the sheriff. Lewis Hale is the farmer that lives next door, kind of functions as an eyewitness. And then we have Mrs. Peters, Mrs. Hale, and of course John Wright, who has died, and Minnie Wright, who has been put in jail. And one of the things that I want you to notice is that the male characters are given a first and last name and also their job description or their job title, I guess you'd say. We never learn Mrs. Peters or Mrs. Hale's first names. They don't have job titles because they were at home, but Glaspell also decides to tie Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale to two of the male characters. So it's said at one point, for example, that Mrs. Peters is married to the law because she's married to the sheriff. Glaspell's playing around right here with some of the societal norms with women's roles during this time. It's also important to note that you might view Minnie Wright as the main character of this play, and we never see or hear from her. She's only spoken of. And then, of course, John Wright is deceased, yet he's spoken of also. So that's kind of an interesting way to set up this play. In terms of the plot, you have the group arriving at the Wright home. Mr. Hale, their neighbor, is kind of an eyewitness to what happened. The men spend a little bit of time looking around in the kitchen, but they spend most of their time as what they see as the scene of the crime, which ends up being significant when we go to examine the play a little bit more thoroughly. The women are asked to gather Mrs. Wright's things, and when they do, they make some really big discoveries. They decide to hide the evidence that they find, and everyone leaves. So that's what happens in the plot of Susan Glaspell's Trifles.